The smoke rising from the valley floor told a story that no one wanted to read. 3 Navy SEALs pinned down in a dry riverbed, one critically wounded, and the Taliban closing in from 3 sides with the kind of patience that comes from knowing victory is inevitable. The JTAC's voice crackled through the radio with the controlled desperation of a man watching his brothers die in real time. He'd called for air support 40 minutes ago. The response had been the same automated acknowledgement, the same promise of assets inbound, the same silence that follows when the truth is that no one is coming. The mountains of Kunar province don't forgive mistakes, and requesting close air support during a sandstorm qualified as asking for a miracle. Every aircraft within 200 miles had been grounded, every aircraft except one. The operations center at Bagram went quiet when the transmission came through. Phantom 6-1 requesting clearance for immediate launch. The voice was calm, almost conversational, like someone asking to borrow a cup of sugar. The tower operator blinked at his screen, certain he'd misheard. Phantom 6-1 negative. All aircraft grounded due to weather. Say again your request. The pause lasted 3 seconds. Tower Phantom 6-1. Those SEALs have been waiting 40 minutes. I'm not asking them to wait 40 more because the sky looks angry. The operator looked across the room at the shift commander, a colonel who'd flown combat missions in 3 wars. The colonel walked slowly to the radio, pressed the transmit button, and asked the question everyone was thinking. Phantom 6-1, what's your fuel state? Another pause. Sufficient for 1 pass, sir. Maybe 2 if I skip the return trip. The colonel closed his eyes. He knew that call sign. Everyone who'd spent time in Afghanistan knew that call sign. Phantom 6-1 belonged to Captain Marcus Prophet Reeves, a former Marine pilot who transitioned to Air Force A-10 duty after losing his wife to cancer 3 years prior. Single father to a 6-year-old daughter. Reputation for flying missions that other pilots called suicide runs with the same casual competence most people applied to grocery shopping. The SEALs didn't know his name. They didn't know he'd already been airborne for 3 hours on a patrol mission when their distress call came through. They didn't know his fuel gauge was reading 20 minutes below minimum safe reserve. They just knew that somewhere above the sandstorm, an angel was descending, and it sounded like thunder wrapped in mercy. The A-10 Thunderbolt II broke through the brown curtain of airborne desert like a prehistoric predator emerging from fog. Visibility was maybe 300 meters, enough to see the ground but not enough to avoid it if things went wrong. Prophet flew by instinct and terrain memory, the aircraft responding to his inputs with the loyal brutality that made the Warthog beloved by ground forces and feared by everything else. The targeting pod was useless in these conditions. He'd be relying on eyeball navigation and the JTAC's voice to separate friendlies from enemies. Phantom 6-1, Viper 2-4, I need danger close. I need it now. I've got 1 man who won't make it another 10 minutes. Prophet's response was matter of fact. Copy danger close. Mark your position with IR strobe. Talk me onto target. Below, the JTAC activated the infrared beacon that would be invisible to the Taliban but show up on Prophet's night vision like a spotlight. The problem was that Prophet wasn't using night vision in a sandstorm. He was using Mark 1 eyeballs and a prayer. The Taliban fighters had moved to within 50 meters of the SEAL's position when they heard it. Not the high scream of a jet, but the deep, guttural roar of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon spinning up to firing speed. The sound arrives before the impact, which gives most targets just enough time to understand they've made a terrible mistake. Prophet came in low, maybe 200 feet off the deck, the A-10's distinctive profile barely visible through the sand until it was directly overhead. The cannon fired in a burst that lasted 3 seconds and sounded like the sky tearing in half. 30mm depleted uranium rounds walked across the hillside where the Taliban had established their firing position. The insurgents who survived the first pass were too stunned to continue the assault. Those who didn't survive became cautionary tailees. Good hits, good hits. The JTAC's voice carried relief and disbelief in equal measure. Phantom 6-1, you just bought us another 15 minutes. We need extract. Prophet was already banking for another pass, his eyes scanning the terrain for the next threat cluster. Working on it, Viper. Stand by. The fuel gauge now read critically low. He'd burned through his reserve, making that gun run at low altitude in high winds. Standard procedure would be to egress immediately, head for the nearest tanker, and let someone else handle the cleanup. Prophet looked at the gauge, looked at the valley below where 3 Americans were still trapped, and made the calculation that separated competent pilots from legendary ones. He keyed the radio. Tower, Phantom 6-1. Be advised I'm Winchester on fuel but continuing to provide cover until extract is complete. The silence from Bagram lasted 5 seconds. When the colonel's voice came back, it carried the weight of someone authorizing a Medal of Honor citation or a funeral. Copy, Phantom. Your call. The sandstorm showed no signs of clearing. If anything, visibility was getting worse. Prophet circled the valley at minimum safe altitude, which in these conditions meant an altitude that was neither minimum nor safe. The Taliban had regrouped and were probing the SEALs' perimeter again, more cautiously this time but with the persistence of men who knew the American air support had to run out of fuel eventually. They were right. Prophet checked his gauge. 8 minutes of flight time remaining, maybe 10 if he leaned the mixture to the point where the engines might decide to quit from sheer indignation. The rescue helicopter was still 20 minutes out. The math didn't work. The JTAC knew it. Phantom 6-1, you need to go, you've done enough. Prophet's laugh came through the radio, dry and humorless. Viper, I'll leave when your wheel's up. Until then, talk to me about threats. The second gun run was even lower than the first. Prophet came in from the opposite direction, using the terrain to mask his approach until the last possible second. The Taliban fighters scattered as the A-10's shadow crossed their position, but not fast enough. The GAU-8 fired again, another 3-second burst that transformed the riverbed into a kill zone. Prophet pulled up hard, the aircraft shuddering as it climbed through turbulent air, and felt the engines cough. Once. Twice. And smooth power returned, but the warning was clear. He was flying on fumes and borrowed time. Viper 2-4 Sitrep. The JTAC's response came fast. All threats neutralized immediate area, but Phantom, you've got smoke trailing from your left engine. Prophet glanced at his mirrors. Sure enough, a thin stream of black smoke was visible even through the sandstorm. He'd taken ground fire during that last pass and hadn't even noticed. Copy visual on the smoke, it's fine. It was not fine. The left engine temperature gauge was climbing into the red. Prophet shut it down, reducing the A-10 to single-engine operation in the middle of a sandstorm with fuel reserves that were now measured in minutes rather than digits. The aircraft became heavier, more sluggish, like trying to swim with a weight belt. Most pilots would have declared an emergency and headed for the nearest runway immediately. Prophet continued to orbit the valley, a one-engine Angel with a cannon and no intention of leaving early. Phantom 6-1 Tower, safe fuel state. He looked at the gauge, 4 minutes, maybe, sufficient for mission completion, Tower. The colonel's voice came back tight with controlled anger. Captain Reeves, do not make me order you to egress. There was a long pause. When Prophet spoke again, his voice carried a tone that most people reserve for explaining simple facts to children. Sir, I have a 6-year-old daughter who drew me a picture of an A-10 last week. She wrote "Daddy saves people" under it. I'd like to be able to tell her that's still true when I get home. The rescue helicopter appeared through the sandstorm like a gift from a generous god. The Pave Hawk descended into the valley with its door gunners scanning for threats, found none thanks to Prophet's work, and began the extraction. The SEALs moved fast, carrying their wounded brother between them, and were aboard in 90 seconds. Prophet watched from above, still circling, the single operating engine running smooth but the fuel gauge now sitting on empty with the low fuel warning light glowing a steady, insistent red. Viper 2-4 is secure, we're wheels up. The relief in the JTAC's voice was palpable. Phantom 6-1, we owe you more than we can pay. Get your bird home safe. Prophet keyed the mic one last time. Just doing the job, Viper. Glad I could help. Then he turned the aircraft northeast toward Bagram and began the longest 30 miles of his life. The right engine quit 12 miles from base. Prophet didn't panic because panic requires energy he was too tired to spend. The A-10 could glide, technically, but glide was a generous term for what amounted to controlled falling with attitude. He'd already shut down every non-essential system to conserve the battery power that kept his instruments alive. No radio now. No way to tell the tower he was coming in dead stick. Just a silent aircraft descending through a sandstorm with a pilot who'd made peace with most of his demons years ago and wasn't particularly afraid of meeting the rest. He thought about his daughter, about the picture she'd drawn, about the solemn way she'd handed it to him and said, "Come home, Daddy." He'd promised her he would. Prophet had never broken a promise to his daughter. The runway appeared through the brown haze like a miracle rendered in concrete and paint. Prophet lined up on final approach with dead engines and no power, the aircraft descending at a rate that was faster than preferred but slower than catastrophic. The tower operators watched in horror as the wounded A-10 materialized from the sandstorm trailing smoke, silent as death itself, and dropping toward the runway with the inevitability of gravity. Someone said, "He's not going to make it." Someone else said, "Shut up and call the crash crew." Prophet pulled back on the stick, trading speed for altitude in the final seconds before touchdown, and felt the aircraft respond one last time. The main gear touched down hard, then the nose gear, and the A-10 rolled out in a straight line as Prophet applied manual brakes. The aircraft stopped 500 feet from the end of the runway. The crash crews arrived 30 seconds later to find Prophet still in the cockpit, helmet off, head back against the seat, smiling the quiet smile of a man who just kept a promise. The debriefing was supposed to be routine. It was not routine. The colonel sat across from Prophet in the small office that smelled of old coffee and older stress and tried to find the right words. "Captain, you disobeyed a direct order to egress. You continued mission operation with critical fuel state and battle damage. You flew single-engine combat operations in IMC conditions." Prophet sat quietly, his flight suit still stained with sweat and dust. "Yes, sir." The colonel leaned forward. "Do you understand that any one of those things could result in disciplinary action?" Prophet met his eyes. "I do, sir." Silence stretched between them like a challenge. Finally, the colonel sat back. "Those 3 SEALs are alive because you decided the rules were more like suggestions today. The Navy is putting you in for the Distinguished Flying Cross. I'm signing the paperwork, but Captain," he paused, searching for the right words, "don't do it again. Your daughter needs you alive more than the Navy needs you decorated." The story spread the way stories do in the military community, through mess halls and flight lines, in emails and phone calls, and the kind of hushed conversations that happen when professionals recognize excellence. Phantom 61 became more than a call sign. It became shorthand for the kind of pilot who shows up when no one else will, who flies missions that the risk-averse decline, who understands that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting consequences. The SEALs sent a bottle of whiskey with a note that read simply, "For the man who couldn't count fuel but could count on himself." Prophet kept the bottle unopened on a shelf in his quarters next to his daughter's drawing. Some gifts are meant to be preserved rather than consumed. 3 months later, Prophet was back in the cockpit flying routine patrol missions. The A-10 he'd nearly crashed had been repaired and returned to service, its battle damage logged and fixed, but its reputation enhanced. Crew chiefs treated that particular aircraft with extra attention, as if proximity to Prophet's legend might rub off on the maintenance crew. Other pilots asked him about the mission in the careful way that people probe legends to see if they're real. Prophet answered their questions with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything, neither embellishing nor diminishing what had happened. Just the facts. Just the job. Just another day in Kunar province where 3 men got to go home because one man decided that empty fuel tanks were less important than empty promises. His daughter never learned the full story. She was 6, and 6-year-olds don't need to know about critical fuel states or single-engine approaches through sandstorms. What she knew was that her daddy came home when he said he would, that his picture was on the wall at the squadron building with other pilots who'd done exceptional things, that when they went to the base for air shows, other pilots shook her father's hand with the kind of respect that doesn't require explanation. She grew up knowing her father was a pilot, but it would be years before she understood that he was the pilot, the one that other aviators mentioned in the same breath as the legends, the man who turned a suicide mission into a rescue operation and lived to file the paperwork. The SEALs didn't forget. One of them, the JTAC who'd called for help and received an angel instead, made it his personal mission to track Prophet down 5 years later. He found him at a ceremony at Nellis Air Force Base where Prophet was receiving yet another commendation for yet another mission that shouldn't have been possible. The SEAL waited until after the formalities, then approached with his wife and 2 children. Captain Reeves. Prophet turned, recognized the voice before he recognized the face. Viper 2-4. They shook hands, then embraced the way warriors do when words fail. The SEAL's wife watched with tears in her eyes. His children, 8 and 6, stood quietly, sensing something important was happening even if they couldn't articulate what. The SEAL finally stepped back. "This is my family. They exist because you decided fuel gauges were optional that day. I don't know how to thank you for that." Prophet looked at the children, thought about his own daughter, now 11 and already showing interest in flying, and smiled. "You just did." The years passed. Prophet eventually retired from active duty and transitioned to civilian life, taking a job as a flight instructor for the next generation of A-10 pilots. He taught them the technical aspects of flying the Warthog, but more importantly, he taught them the philosophy behind it. "This aircraft exists for one reason," he'd tell each new class. "To protect people on the ground who can't protect themselves. Everything else is secondary. The mission, the medals, the recognition. All secondary. You fly this machine, you make a promise to every soldier down there that you'll show up when they call. That's the job. That's the only job that matters." The students listened with the kind of attention that suggests they understood they were receiving wisdom rather than instruction. Some of them would go on to have their own moments, their own impossible missions, their own stories that started with a desperate radio call and ended with an angel descending through weather that grounded everyone else. His daughter followed him into aviation, as he'd secretly hoped and publicly never pressured. She flew helicopters, not A-10s, but the instinct was the same. The commitment to the mission over the self, the willingness to launch when others landed. She wore her father's old call sign as a patch on her flight suit, unauthorized but tolerated because everyone knew the story by then. Phantom 6-1 had become mythology, and mythology doesn't follow regulations. During her own combat deployments, she'd sometimes hear the story from soldiers who didn't know she was Prophet's daughter. They'd tell it around campfires or in mess halls, the details growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling but the core remaining true. A pilot who flew on empty, a rescue that shouldn't have happened. 3 men who went home. She'd listen quietly, smile to herself, and think about the drawing she'd made when she was 6 years old. Daddy saves people. Still true, always true. The memorial came years later, long after Prophet had left the service and settled into the quiet dignity of retirement. The Air Force dedicated a building at Bagram in his honor, not for the one mission but for a career of them, for the accumulated weight of showing up when showing up seemed impossible. The dedication ceremony drew pilots from 3 generations, SEALs who'd been saved by A-10 runs, crew chiefs who'd kept the Warthogs flying, and one retired colonel who'd authorized a mission he thought would end in a funeral. They told stories. They raised glasses. They spoke about a man who'd understood that the job wasn't about the aircraft or the weapons or even the flying. It was about the promise. Prophet attended, uncomfortable with the attention as always, and gave a speech that lasted 90 seconds. "I just flew the plane," he said. "The aircraft did the work. Thank the engineers who built it tough enough to take hits and keep flying. Thank the crew chiefs who kept it running when it should have quit. Thank the soldiers who trusted me to show up. I just flew the plane." The applause that followed suggested no one believed him, but everyone understood why he'd say it. The last time anyone saw Prophet fly was at an air show 3 years before his death. He was 71, still sharp, still carrying himself with the upright posture of a man who'd spent decades in a cockpit. The organizers had arranged for him to fly a heritage flight, an A-10 in formation with modern fighters, a symbolic passing of the torch. He climbed into the cockpit with the muscle memory of 10,000 flights, ran through his checks with the precision of ritual, and took off into a clear blue sky that seemed to welcome him home. The crowd watched as he put the Warthog through its paces, not aggressive but elegant, showing what the aircraft could do in the hands of someone who understood it completely. When he landed, the ovation lasted 5 minutes. He taxied to the ramp, shut down the engines, and climbed out slowly, his face carrying the satisfied expression of a man who just completed something important. He signed autographs for 2 hours, mostly for children who would grow up remembering the day they met the pilot their parents had told them about. Prophet died quietly in his sleep at 74, surrounded by family, his walls covered with photographs of the people he'd saved and the aircraft he'd flown. His daughter found the old drawing she'd made, preserved behind glass, still hanging in his study. "Daddy saves people." She stood there for a long time, holding the frame, understanding now what she'd only intuited as a child. Her father hadn't just saved people during that mission in Kunar province. He'd saved them on dozens of missions. Hundreds, probably. He'd saved them by teaching other pilots how to think about the job. He'd saved them by example, by showing up, by making promises and keeping them even when keeping them cost everything he had. The funeral drew crowds from across the military community. SEALs, pilots, soldiers who'd called for air support and received angels. They came to say goodbye to a legend and discovered they were saying goodbye to a man who'd never wanted to be legendary. Just competent. Just reliable, just there when it mattered. The eulogies told the same story from different angles. The colonel, now long retired himself, spoke about the moment he'd authorized a mission he knew might end in disaster and watched it end in triumph. "Captain Reeves taught me that leadership isn't about making safe decisions," he said. "It's about trusting good people to make the right call even when the right call looks wrong on paper." The SEAL whose life had been saved spoke about carrying the memory of that day for decades, about hearing the A-10s roar through a sandstorm, and knowing that someone had decided he was worth saving. "I've lived 43 years since that day in the valley," he said, his voice breaking. "Every moment of those years exists because one man couldn't count fuel but could count on himself." Prophet's daughter spoke last, her voice steady despite the tears. "My father was many things. A pilot, a Marine, a warrior. But to me, he was the man who always came home, who kept his promises, who taught me that the measure of a person isn't in their triumphs but in their willingness to show up when showing up seems impossible. I'm proud to be his daughter. I'm grateful to have flown with his lessons guiding me, and I'm honored that his story will continue inspiring pilots long after we're all gone." They buried him with full military honors at Arlington, the ceremony attended by hundreds and watched by thousands more via livestream. The A-10 community conducted a missing man formation over the cemetery, 4 aircraft flying in tight formation until one broke away and climbed toward the sun, symbolizing the warrior departing for his final mission. The sound of those engines, the distinctive roar of the GAU-8 being test-fired in salute, echoed across the hills and carried to the ears of people who'd never met Prophet but knew his story. In mess halls and ready rooms, at air shows and memorial services, in classrooms where young pilots learned their trade, the story continued. Not just the one mission, though that remained the centerpiece, but the whole career, the accumulated evidence of a life lived in service to others. The proof that one person, making the right choices consistently, can create ripples that become waves that become legends. Years after his death, a young A-10 pilot found herself in Afghanistan, orbiting over a valley where soldiers were pinned down, fuel gauge reading below minimum safe reserve, whether closing in. She heard the JTAC's desperate call for air support. She looked at her fuel gauge, calculated the odds, and thought about a story she'd heard in flight school, about a pilot who'd ignored empty tanks to keep a promise, about an aircraft that flew on will when the fuel ran out. About 3 SEALs who went home because one man decided that math was negotiable but promises weren't. She keyed the radio. Ground element, Phantom 6-5. I'm inbound. Mark your position. The JTAC's relief was palpable. Copy 6-5. Are you sure you have fuel for this? She smiled inside her mask, thought about a drawing a little girl had made 40 years earlier, and answered with the calm confidence of someone who understood exactly what she was promising. Sufficient for mission completion. Talk me onto target. The A-10 descended through bad weather toward good people who needed help, carrying a pilot who'd learned from a legend that the job wasn't about the odds. It was about showing up, always showing up, until the mission was complete and everyone went home.